And we're live. How's it going, buddy?
It's going well, man. And you?
I am doing well on this fine morning. Do you have coffee yet?
I'm drinking coffee as we speak.
All right, so we're going to get smarter as this goes. So this is what I thought we'd do. I've always wanted to be in the same room as you when someone on the internet misinterprets something that you say. And I've always wanted to see like the red just rising, and then you just explode and then explain everything you wanted to say, but then you don't press send. You just fucking try to press send, but you don't press send. So I want to try to be in the room for a few of those things. So I went and I pulled some famous Dr. Michael Chivers quotes off the internet,
which I didn't know I had.
It's incredible. Dr. Michael Chivers quotes, there's a whole list of them. It's like you, Richard Feynman, and Einstein. Okay, so I figured I'd just read some of these, and then obviously, you know what's interesting about when we talk to each other is that because we always lecture the same things, I always say that I'd rather attend yours instead of coming to mine, because I get to hear all of the stuff that we've been talking about over these years. I get to hear it in a completely different way, if that makes sense. So I think I'm going to turn this off 1 second.
And then it's the same for me, right? Like sometimes you get caught up in your own head. So it's good to hear things from a different perspective, even though we're talking about the same thing. You know, I was thinking about this before you get in. I was thinking about this before we actually got on here. So, you know, I hope people are starting to see that, you know, FRS is not a one size fits all type thing. You know, we're talking about a scientific thought process that we put an astronomical amount of time in to try to rationalize, you know, and it's so interesting that you and I read the same things. You know, our interests are the same for the most part. We have different, you know, interests outside of academia per se. You know, like you like to beat people up and I like to play sports and stuff like that. But when we read the same stuff. So we read a lot of physics stuff, we read a lot of biology stuff, we read a lot of, you know, whatever the case is. And we can read the same stuff and we can not come to different conclusions per se, but the way you interpret it and the lens that you filter things through, just again, because of your experiences, you know, in school and your experiences in, you know, movement and what you've done, you interpret them differently than I interpret them. But therefore we can have a very fruitful discussion about, you know, the same topic, but, you know, I often learn something about that topic that maybe I didn't interpret from reading that thing. And I would suppose that probably you know, would learn something just by the way I interpret that topic, you know. And I think a lot about like the summits that we've had in terms of, you know, some of that material. And a lot of those summits were just like, hey, we should do this, or here's a topic for a summit. Here's what we haven't touched on, or here's where we need to take certain things, you know, and we go and, you know, you do your thing and I do my thing, and then we periodically meet about these things, and it's often very crazy that we're on the same page. You know, we may be on different lines of the page, but we're on the same page, and therefore, you know, when we have these summits, or when you and I get together, or when, you know, other people that are involved in FRS, we all think very similarly. But it's interesting that we can all teach each other something about a topic that maybe we haven't thought of, or we didn't interpret it that way, or we didn't see it exactly that way. So these discussions that we have are often really, really interesting. And so when you say it would be interesting to sit on one of your lectures, you know, I feel the same about anybody. I feel the same about you. I feel the same about Dewey, you know, because, you know, it's awesome just to see the way that different people interpret things. And then, you know, you can run that through your filter and go, oh, okay, I understand why they said that the way they said that, or I understand why they explained that the way they explained that, or I understand why they use that particular analogy. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Which goes to how we speak about research and about what you're supposed to be It's like when two people are trying to figure something out, or not two people, in our case, we have a whole group of people, but when you're trying to figure something out, and you interpret it and you run it through like a systematic approach. It's good. We've been doing it for so long, and we've looked at, what we do from so many angles that, like you said, when you and I read a book on particle physics, or if we read a book on, you know what I mean, we'll draw in information. We'll draw information from those topics, and we'll pull them into trying to understand the topic that we specialize in, right? So like you said, you pull from different lenses. So at the summit, we pulled from like a physics lens. We looked at the basic laws of physics, and we said, if we look at the basic laws of physics, and we run that, through, or we run our ideas as how we manage people through these laws, do they still make sense? And we did this with evolutionary biology, and we did the same, which is also interesting, because you'll attest to this. When we're asked, what do you read? It really sums up kind of the problem with how people look at literature. When we do our lectures, I stop and say, what you're about to get is an interpretation of the literature. So I've consumed it, I've interpreted it, I've had conversations with other people who consume and interpret the literature, and now we have to start to piece these things together, right?
Of course.
What frustrates me on the internet, for example, is when, if somebody takes a sentence you say, and then they run with it out of context, not wanting to know what the paragraph was that was attached to that sentence. They just want to take this sentence and say, hey, look at that. Hey, look at this paper. And that brings us back to the other thing. It's like, we always say, when you're consuming the scientific literature, you're consuming it as a person who has previous notions and thoughts, and you're bringing something different to the table. So it's okay if the interpretation is different, as long as you give it enough attention and you're not just going by the introduction. I talked to Menta the other day on the podcast, and he was talking about how so many people now, they read the introduction, but the introduction is really there to sell the paper, right?
Sure.
It's a teaser, and what you're supposed to do is dive into it and then, make decisions as to how does this information apply to you? Like, what does it mean to you? Which definitely. And I think, you know what, I'll be honest, when we were in chiro school, remember when we were in chiro school, in fourth year, you had to get all these papers to back up exactly what you did. Yeah.
Not that I half-ass things, because I never do, obviously, but a lot of times, if you're pressed for time, thinking back, remember in fourth year when you thought you had so much stuff to do and you really didn't have that much stuff to do?
Nothing.
Now life is far more difficult. Anyway, often people would be like, oh, or you might sort of skip out on a paper and you might read the intro and the discussion. And you're like, oh, I know what's going on now. And then one of the things that I actually learned when we did our residency was, that's not really it.
No.
That's not really it. You have to, you kind of have to ruminate with that paper a little bit and look at, I'm not one to say that I, look at the stats and, I'm really calculating my own,
you can't explain a paired t-test to me right now?
No, definitely not. I mean, I took that stuff enough that I probably should, but I mean, I don't do that, but I think you do have to interpret that to the best of your ability, to try to tease out what the paper is trying to tell you. It's getting back to what you were saying before. I know both of us have read quite a bit of E.O. Wilson. And one of his things that sticks out with me quite a bit, I can picture the page because I know exactly in the book where it is. I couldn't tell you exactly word for word what it is, but his book on consilience is probably necessary reading for everybody, because in that book, you have a hardcore biologist, a hardcore systems thinker in the study of entomology, which I don't really care too much about, but you have a hardcore.
The way he explains it, you kind of do, though.
You kind of do, yeah. But you have a hardcore biologist saying, you know what? I don't learn from biology per se. I learn when I take other things and I advance, my understanding of my own topic, when I take in other things and I run them through my lens, and I can, discard what doesn't apply, and I can set it aside for now, and I can take what I can apply, and maybe it helps me understand something in my own realm a little bit differently. And those things that don't apply right now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to apply ever. That just means that you just don't have enough information right now to fit them into your model of how you look at things. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the thing that I think bothers me a lot about people who are trying to be evidence-based, is they take the evidence, and then, you know, for whatever reason, everything that came before it doesn't mean anything anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just, did you read this new paper on, you know, ACL reconstruction, or did you read this paper on the biomechanics of this? And, you know, in the realm of science, that's just a very, very small blip in, you know, the accumulation of the process of knowledge and gaining knowledge. And so, you know, you've mentioned this a lot, and I know, you know, we have talked about this a lot. This is where you get into like article chasers and people who are just trying to be evidence-based by saying that they, you know, they go on PubMed and they read what's new every month, but they often don't have a model to stand on, because they're so swayed so often about different findings that, you know, they often get lost in terms of what does this mean? How do I apply this? You know, we call this sort of that paralysis by analysis. I don't know if that exactly fits, but, you know, I think if people just took science for what it is, it's really nothing more than just and just took what you get from that. And everybody has a model of how they look at things. Everybody has a lens of how they look at things. I mean, that's often what we teach people, is we teach people that, you know, there's these lenses that we think are important that you should run your information through. And, you know, if it works, great. If it doesn't, you know, don't necessarily discard it. Just dig a little bit deeper and maybe look at trying to reconcile more things about that topic. You know, if you often don't understand something, it's not like and I try to teach this to my kids as well. If you don't understand something, don't just keep beating your head up against the wall. Like, look at other places. You have resources everywhere to try to figure something out.
You know, you can identify these people. I was just thinking by the amount of, you know, I'm all for saying something, I don't think this works, I don't think that works, as long as you have an explanation. But when your entire output to the world, right, when your contribution to the ether is simply, don't do this, that doesn't work, that's not a thing. And if you can actually rate it in the tweets. If I'm not seeing, okay, what do you do? Someone
totally.
in that, I almost dismiss that person, because it's extraordinarily easy to take a concept, run to the research, and find a single paper to contradict what you said. I can do that on almost any topic, right? So when someone uses research with always a negative lens, not as a lens to try to discover, but as a lens to try to defeat, well, then you're not going to be helpful to me, right? Because I read that paper too, right? It's like people, you know what I think? People actually think that they're the only ones sometimes that read or that have access to papers, right? Well, oh, you didn't read this paper. We get this a lot. You say something, it's like, well, you didn't read this paper. Well, yeah, no, we did. We read it, we processed it, and then we put it on the piles, right? We didn't just say, go with the last paper. We put it on the piles to make our arguments. And then, you know, over the past 600 years of the scientific revolution, some arguments get better and better, and some of them lag behind, but it's building a stack of papers, right?
Yeah, of course.
It's not, and then it's pulling other disciplines into these papers and making a real fucking mess of it, is what it is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. You know, again, I agree with all of that. And you know, we don't necessarily have to get into the philosophy of science, because I don't pretend to be a philosopher, but, you know, I know we both are familiar with a little bit of Karl Popper stuff. And that's not what he says. It's not, you know, what he says is that you have to come up with models, you have to come up with hypotheses, and you have to gather information to try to falsify your hypothesis. But even in the process of falsifying your hypothesis, that doesn't mean that you just discard everything. I mean, we can't just keep saying, particularly this happens in our world, more so in manual therapy, I think, than in strength and conditioning, just because I know more about the manual therapy world. We have people who are saying, like, oh, everything you learn in chiro school, whatever you learn in physio school, don't do it because it doesn't work. Well, that's not exactly right.
Well, let's get into that, because that's a big topic. Like, yeah, there's hundreds of years of information, and it's all killed by one blog that looks at the resiliency of fascia or something like that. Like, it just, everything falls to nothing based on that. So you've talked about this a lot, is that the status of research, let's say on soft tissue therapy, or the status of, not necessarily the status of, there's a lot of information out there on soft tissue therapy throughout the years, but with regards to specifically understanding the mechanism, I believe that anybody in our profession would agree that mechanotransduction has to be understood, right? That's kind of where we are in the understanding of what we're doing. So the question is that where are we with regards to the research on mechanotransduction? And is there enough of it to negate? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I always think back to Einstein, and if he gave out one of those thought experiments, like the one on the train when he's observing the person as they go, but you imagine he goes next door to his colleague's office and he goes, hey, look at this. And he explains the thought experiment. And then that guy goes on to PubMed or whatever the hell they had back then, which is nothing close to PubMed. And, he writes in the thought experiment, presses enter, and he doesn't see a paper on it. Yeah. And he's like, sorry, Albert, all that shit's, it's not evidence-based. Yeah. Right. And then that would have been it. You know what I mean? So speak to that with regards to the concept of mechanotransduction, which for people who are not manual therapists, we're speaking about how your tissues respond when you're being, let's say you're getting a massage or you're getting any kind of soft tissue work. Mechanotransduction is discussing the propagation of force through the tissue and the effects of the transduction of that force on the tissue. So what do we know? Sum it up.
Well, I'll start by saying this, is that we know, this is going to sound very oxymoronic. We know a lot. We know a lot about mechanotransduction. We know a lot about the process of it. We know a lot about what we think is happening. We know a lot about the players involved about mechanotransduction. But in all of that, we know very little in terms of how that applies to a bigger concept, and how that potentially applies to what we do. And the reason is just because and again, this is, I hate to keep saying we've talked about this, but this is something that we've talked about as well. Like, in manual therapy, we don't have a large pool of evidence to pull from. I mean, manual therapy evidence has been around for 40 years, maybe 50 years. And, in looking at all of that, soft tissue in and of itself hasn't really been looked at with any sort of scientific rigor. And part of that is just because we haven't defined, I don't think, what soft tissue is. Most people think soft tissue is, something that involves the soft tissue. So that could range anywhere. And the literature tells us this. That could be anything from stretching after activity or stretching after treatment to, foam rolling, to tennis ball work, to, massage ball work, all the way into soft tissue massage, which again is not something that we've actually, rigorously defined. So part of the issue that we have in soft tissue therapy is we haven't defined what that is. And so that is the first thing that I think we have defined for people. We have defined soft tissue as being the process of how we, start the loading process of tissue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've rationalized that with a scientific base, saying that, force is a necessary requirement for tissues to adapt. We know this. That's just sort of some basic science on what tissue is and why we're human. So force is necessary. We've also found that the direction of that force is a necessary requirement. Therefore, we can apply that into soft tissue. And we've found that that has to be done for a certain period of time, which we've also defined. So I think part of what we've done is we've given people at least a definition of what we think soft tissue is and what it looks like. And then, if you can go with that definition, which is far different than what most people's conceptualizations of what soft tissue are, then at least we have something to work with. You know what I'm saying? So at least we can then say, okay, well, now let's look at what the research tells us about those necessary requirements of soft tissue. And then we can start to say, well, that might eliminate certain things that we thought were soft tissue interventions. And then we can say, okay, well, now let's look at what we think is a soft tissue intervention. And unfortunately, this is where, the literature itself breaks down, because we don't have that. And if we do have that, I believe that the definition with respect to that literature doesn't jive with what has not been something that we've made up. It's been something that the literature actually tells us is a necessary requirement. And so this is where you kind of got into this whole, well, soft tissue doesn't do anything. Soft tissue is a neurological response, and it this is how we have to look at it, and so on and so forth. And I agree with all of that, because you can't discount any of that. There's, we've talked about this, you have talked about this, I've talked about this. There's something neurological about touch that we also have to scientifically rationalize. And there's something neurological about the fact that, because most of how we function is entirely based on sensory perception, that there's going to be some nervous system involvement of soft tissue. But for most people, that's where they stop. And for us, that wasn't good enough, because we know that there are changes that happen as a result of potentially abiding by these soft tissue rules that we can now put into the soft tissue definition. And that's what gets us into mechanotransduction. And so mechanotransduction has been around for 20 years or more. If you look at Ingber's original papers on it, early 90s.
Donald Ingber, for those listening.
Yeah, Don Ingber is sort of the godfather of mechanotransduction. I don't even remember if he was calling it mechanotransduction back then, but he was basically telling us that what we are made up of from a cellular perspective responds to the things that we used to define soft tissue inputs. And so now we can start to put that together and go, oh, geez, well, maybe there's something is to this. And I remember, gosh, like what, 15 years ago when we were reading Ingber stuff, and we're going, man, this is the stuff that we never got when we were in chiro school. This is the stuff that we never got, when we started practice and we're doing these things and weren't really understanding what we were doing and why we were making the changes that we were making, or potentially making. And so, if you follow that line for the last 20 years, Ingber basically started a scientific revolution in cellular and molecular biology, because you can't go into PubMed right now and look at cellular biology or molecular biology and not see the word mechanotransduction and not see the concept of cells responding to force. And so again, we don't have to get into a huge amount of detail, but we've started to, and when I say we, I mean not us, but like science has started to really parse out the details on, you know, what parts of the cell are responsive to force and how do they do this, and you know, how long does it last, and how big is that force propagated, and for what distance. I mean, we have, and what time frame. We have these things now, and so we can start to gather information now about really important things about soft tissue and how long we should do it, and when can we expect some change, and you know, are we making change. And unfortunately, for a lot of people in the manual world, they just refuse to acknowledge any of this stuff, that it even exists, because for some reason, a living human being cannot be adaptable from a tissue perspective. Yet they can believe that exercise, or they can believe in the overload principle, and they can believe in adaptation from that perspective, but they can't see it from a soft tissue perspective. And we've always said that, you know, that's kind of the start of how you introduce the concept of load. Mechanotransduction exists everywhere, from soft tissue into you know, strength and conditioning. It's just, it's interesting that we can see it for one, but we can't see it for another. And this is why we say that force is the main input. This is where all that came from. And you know, there's a whole dearth of literature that people just refuse to acknowledge, because they just want to say, they just want it to be easy, and it's not easy to try to rationalize these things. You know what I'm saying? And you know, if you look at science, you know, we mentioned Karl Popper, but if you kind of look at how science has progressed philosophically from Popper, I believe his name is Thomas Kuhn. Anyway, he wrote a book on something about scientific revolutions. And he talked about the difference between quote unquote normal science and revolutionary science. And normal science, he just called scientists that are puzzle solvers. You know what I'm saying? Like they just do experiments to say that they did experiments, and they follow the scientific method, and they just reproduce the same stuff all the time. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Which is a lot of what science is. And I'm not saying that that's bad per se, but that's a lot of what science is. And then he talks about revolutionary science, where, you know, someone had the courage to say, man, I'm seeing something different here, or I'm looking at things differently, and really trying to understand why they might be different than just putting a puzzle together again, because that's not really what science is. And to progress science, you need these periods of revolutionary science where someone has the balls to say, shit, I'm looking at this differently, and my way of looking at it is producing results. And that's where we are in biology. It's, you know, we just, from a manual perspective, and from a chiropractic and a PT perspective, I guess, massage perspective, we just haven't jumped into that revolution yet.
All right. So I was thinking while you were explaining that, is that I think maybe people are talking past each other because of the lack of definition on the topic. And you were speaking to this earlier with regards to research. And I've said this before too, with regards to like low back research. If you take, you know, 100 people and you have a particular input for low back pain that you're going to apply to check the relevance of that input, or whatever, what type of treatment, you can't just divide the people in half and say, half of you go to that non-treatment group and half of you go to this treatment group, try it and see what happens. Because you're kind of telling me that everyone experiences low back pain in the exact same way, right? So
yeah,
you're not defining the groups, right? If somebody had low back pain because their SI joint was in pain, that's one thing. If somebody was stabbed in the fucking spine with a pencil, that's a different thing, and they can't be allotted to the same group, which is, I think, well, from what I see in the literature, that's a lot of what's happened, is that the groups haven't been defined. And you were speaking to that earlier too. If you look at ACL reconstruction, you know, rehabilitation paper, it's pretty much someone goes to the rehab group and then other people go to the non-rehab group. Once again, saying that rehab is somehow a generic thing. Like, I'm applying rehab to someone, right? I'm sprinkling rehab on someone's shoulder. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then
It's
you
like the
look at,
magic fairy dust.
yeah, you look at the results and then you go, oh, it's okay. Like when you look at spinal manipulative therapy, if you look at it from a whole, you read a bunch of papers, and what do you conclude? You conclude, it's a good form of treatment to add to people with back pain, but it's not like you see amazing results. Like you ask a therapist, you know, what do you think about the therapy you use? You go, oh my God, it works so well. Then you go into the literature and it's like, yeah, 55% of the time it works. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think it's because you're not defining the target. And we said this before. If you think your treatments do anything, then you have to agree that the more specific the target you're applying the treatment to, the better it should work.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And there we go with soft tissue. So now think about this in forms of soft tissue. I don't think when you say soft tissue, when I say soft tissue, when people hear what we say, their interpretation of what soft tissue is not the same. And that's where we get confused with the neurology and the biology. What we're saying with soft tissue is there's only really one way for us to speak to the body long term, right? And that's with forces. So you put forces into the body and then the body responds to the forces. How does it respond? It responds neurologically, but it responds biologically. And if you look at the research in general, what you should, I think, conclude, and what I know you conclude is, you can't have permanent neurologic change unless you have subsequent biologic change. And you can't have permanent biologic change unless you have subsequent neurologic change. Okay?
Agreed.
But if you think of soft tissue as, I'm going to make your boo-boo feel better, and that's the point of difference. When I go to you to get soft tissue work, or you come to me to get soft tissue work, I'm not trying to find where it hurts and then rub the hurt away. So pain isn't necessarily the outcome measure. What we're trying to do is we're trying to apply forces in a way that we understand the body reacts to forces. And we're saying that you have to impart the forces over a period of time, because there's no such thing as a paper in the scientific literature that demonstrates that you can put one biological input into the system and change it permanently. It doesn't happen. So I can talk about, for example, things that seemingly only affect the skin, okay? So there's treatments to affect, you have pain here, you can do things to the skin, you can put tape on the skin, you can rub the skin, you can dermally abrade the skin, you can, take instruments and whatever to the skin. We're not saying you're not going to find results. We're not saying that if you bang your elbow and you go, that's not going to feel better. Of course it's going to feel better. That's just not our goal. Right. Our goal is the long-term management of the person's meat, of their system, right? Of how the neurology speaks to the biology, how the biology subsequently feeds back information to the neurology. Because that's what really matters long-term. Sure, there are some, someone comes to us, they're in pain. We do things to quell their pain. I get it. But the idea that what we're doing is a long-term reducer of pain, I just don't know how you can look at literature or practice and come to that conclusion, right? I don't remember, I've been practicing for a while and so have you. And one thing I would not call practice is easy. I would not say that it's easy to reduce symptoms. But if you go by the rubby idea, like another example I had, there's a paper, I don't want to mention it, but there's a paper that says, if someone has pain here, hi Daniela. Hi Dad. Say hi to the thousands of people on the content. If you have pain here, right, in the patellar tendon, apparently there's a spot somewhere more proximally in your vastus lateralis or something where if you rub it, you'll fix the pain here, right? Now think about this logically. Let's say that the pain here is caused by patellar tendinopathy, which we know to be a long-term degenerative change of the histology of the tissue, in that the cells become disorganized, they lay down cross-bridging, and you know what I mean? Like there's neovascularization, there's pain sensitivity, there's degeneration, the rope is starting to peel, a tendinopathy is occurring, okay? For fuck's sakes, that didn't happen yesterday, right? Like broken down tendons happening over a period of time. So the idea that you can rub something here and make this better is to say that somehow you have found a magical spot in the body where when you rub these cells decide to completely reorganize themselves and go back to where they were before. Oh shit, wait, cells don't have brains. So they don't know what they were before. So how can it even be? You see what I'm saying? Like,
100%.
How can that be a thing? So again, I think that if we define it as force input, that's it. We're not even speaking about the same topic.
Yes. I agree with you 100%. And that's why I wanted to start the answer to that question. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I think, one of the things that, that we talk a lot about in the system, specifically in FR with respect to soft tissue stuff, is that we have to define it. We have to define that there are certain things that are necessary to occur for it to be considered a soft tissue input. And that's what we spend all our time discussing and learning about, and how to practically apply. And getting to what you were saying, we've argued this a lot, but I almost can't. I fault people, but I almost can't fault people, because if you look at the research, the outcome measures that are often used are easy ones. Did I change the VAS on this patient? Did my 4 weeks of rehab, or my 4 weeks of soft tissue therapy, or my 4 weeks of laser, or my 12 sessions, did they change the VAS? So we often use pain as an outcome, or pain is often used as an outcome in research. So therefore it just translates into practice. Oh, well, if somebody has pain, I'll just throw these things at it and hopefully change. And then the other thing that we often use in research is, somehow did this lead to a change in range of motion or strength? Okay. Somehow.
Yeah.
Which we know is one of those things that takes a lot longer than 12 sessions of laser, or 4 weeks of 1 hour a day foam rolling to actually change. So I think, coming back to all of this, I think we just don't know, again, just because it's poorly defined. The whole thing is poorly defined from the get-go, that we just haven't applied the appropriate outcome measures. Therefore, we haven't applied the appropriate scientific methodologies to actually really understand why things are happening the way they are. And so that's why we get a lot of people saying, well, there's no evidence for this, or the evidence sucks, or don't do any of this, and so on and so forth. I mean, if that was truly the case, then, in our 15, 16 years of practice, the thousands upon thousands of people that we helped wouldn't have been helped.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've unless we study soft tissue with the precision that surgeons study their craft with, we're never going to know the true benefits, right? And
you know what? And well, I know right now, because that's too hard for us. We're not there yet. We don't have the instrumentation, and therefore the methodologies to do that yet. So, but again, that doesn't mean that we say, well, it's not doing anything.
Well,
means that.
But okay, so there's no evidence in the way that people define evidence. There's plenty of evidence to guide what you should be doing, and that is the systems that we put out to the world. Is that there's enough evidence to guide, and there's enough. There's no evidence in that the soft tissue evidence. If you look up soft tissue papers, that doesn't help you. But if you go into the biophysics, the cellular biophysics as to how cells respond to force, how cells propagate force, how tissue responds to force, and then you start to sprinkle in the effects of soft tissue, you can make an incredibly strong argument that even if the soft tissue is there to allow the person to move more, right?
Yes.
Then it's good enough just at that. Like, it's good enough to, no one's going to tell me that moving tissue is, and the application of internal loads by, force, by lifting, by pushing, by training, no one's going to say that doesn't change tissue. That would be a crazy thing to say, right? So if what we're doing can enhance that, which is really what the system is, it's enhancing the training, which is really what long-term fixes.
Yes.
The treatment is
Yep.
what sets up the environment
Yep.
that the subsequent training inputs, which are multiple and repeated, can begin to adapt over time. Right? So,
Yes.
but I want to pull something out because I want to get to that topic too, because we talked about outcome measures and you pulled one out, which I think confuses people to no end, and it's range of motion. Okay. So I'm going to throw these questions at you, and I want you to just give me so number one, if you take a bird's eye view of the literature with regards to range of motion,
Yep.
is it an effective outcome measure when it comes to pain or injury prevention?
Yes.
Go.
So again, I'll take you on a little journey of how we got to trying to think of range of motion, and I'll kind of take you on where I think we are right now, because I know you and I have talked about this as well. So again, I'll take it back to school days.
Yes.
Remember in school
Take
days,
me back to school, Mikey.
When we were in chiro school, range of motion was
All this was black, by the way, back then. I'm just noticing that.
I couldn't even grow this back then.
Hold on.
Range of motion was one of those things that you did. Oh, am I good now?
Yeah, you're good now.
So range of motion was just one of those things that you did as part of your orthopedic examination, right? And so I remember in chiro school, remember we had to memorize, or at least I did, because I'm like that. I memorized every single range of motion of every single joint in the body so that I could understand how to do it on an orthopedic exam. Mm-hmm. And, we were taught active range of motion, we were taught passive range of motion, but I really didn't understand range of motion. And that's not how you understand range of motion. It's not a thing that, comes included with your shoulder. It's not a thing that, comes included with, all these other joints. And so I think over the years, what we've done is we've tried to tease out what range of motion actually is. And so range of motion actually is, two different things. So again, getting back to the school days in chiro school, we always did active range of motion first, and then you push that thing a little bit more, and that somehow delineated your passive range of motion. Mm-hmm. And we know that you could push somebody passively more than they could move actively. And so when you really start to tease that out, that means that range of motion is inherently two different qualities. So it's made up of two different things. So it's made up of some passive qualities and it's made up of some active qualities. And I think that's the first thing that we should probably try to tease out with respect to range of motion, is that there are some passive properties that will influence range of motion that are necessary within tissues. And there are some active qualities that are necessary to have working to achieve active range of motion. So we've teased all that out. That really just means that your passive range of motion, you'll have some neurological things. So you'll have some muscle neurological stuff, which is really just sarcomere overlap. And you'll have some bioflow stuff, which in our system is just the continuity of connective tissue or white stuff that's involved. And so, as you move something from short to long, those two things are in play when we move in passive range of motion, which is really just taking something from a shortened position to a lengthened position. And so really what that is that means that something that's moved from short to long, we know that it will increase in tension. And so the tension comes from these active components and these passive components. And that's really just, a basic understanding of what we call length tension, or the length tension relationship. So if you really tease that out, that means that passive range of motion is an investigation in normal length tension relationships. Because again, we talk about this in FR. We use it as a drill, as a matter of fact, that if you take something from, if I take my arm like this, there'll be no tension in my bicep. And as I lengthen it out, there will be tension in my bicep. And that's just a normal relationship. And it's the relationship that passive range of motion displays. And within that, you have the force length curve, which is the length curve of a sarcomere. And that's part of the active component of range of motion. So now you can tease the active component away from the passive component. So there's these two things, passive properties and active properties, that overlap into what we generally just call range of motion. And so most people are here.
If I just to define for the people who are not in our profession, so we can say the active qualities are the ones being influenced by neurological activity.
That's right.
And then passive components is just the physical,
the physical stretching of the tissues.
Stretching of stuff. Continue.
Yes. So most people just look at those as being one thing. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to tease them out and say, well, those give us two indications of, let's say, system properties with respect to range of motion. And so when you start to qualify that there are these two things, it helps you understand why range of motion might be an important quality that people have. And oftentimes I talk about range of motion as being a base rate. And so when we talk about base rates are things that have to be there for other things to happen. They're like you talk a lot about prerequisites. It's the same thing. We're just coming from two different frameworks there. And so range of motion is the base rate for movement. And so now we can say that there is a passive base rate that we should have, and there's an active base rate that we should have. And we've sort of gone into the literature on that stuff and tried to tease those out. And we know now that, as we learned in chiro school, just nobody taught us this, is that passive is bigger than active to a certain extent. And so that means that if we're looking at passive range of motion as being bigger and less active than active range of motion, it should be the first base rate that we look at. And so we've sort of gone in, I won't get into the nitty gritty of all that, but that's kind of what we look at in our system as being sort of that first base rate. And we equate that not to a number, as most people will do. We equate that to a system demand, because that's really important, because there's a lot of things that you have to then, qualify for yourself in terms of the demand of what that passive range of motion should be. And that's the person that's kind of sitting in front of you, that you're looking at, and what activities they do, and what demands do they have, and how stressed out are they. And
so in other words, I want to jump in again. So in other words, when someone asks you how much range of motion do you need, that's a very common question. And we're often accused of creating contortionists for some reason.
Yep.
I think only because we work with contortionists and dancers and gymnasts that people think that that's always our goal. But we've said from the beginning that you only need as much range of motion as your system demands you need, plus a buffer, right? So what you were saying, just to rephrase, is that, we're not looking for 120 degrees because that's normal. We're looking for 120 degrees because that's what you use for your body. And we're defining normal as being what it is that you want to do with your body. Because we've said before, you can define joints as normal by taking the average of 100 humans and say ankle range of motion in these 100 humans was this. But what you're doing is taking the shitty average of probably a lot of shitty ankles, right?
That's right.
You can't tell me that the ankle range of motion is normal at this, it's abnormal at that, because if you give me an Olympic lifter, I got to make that ankle abnormal just to function normally in the context of lifting. So
That's
go ahead.
right.
Yep.
So that gets us into those two terms, which is, what is the prerequisite for the demand, or what is the base rate for the demand? And the passive range of motion has to be that plus a buffer, as you said, just
Okay.
because, we'll get into that in a second, why we need that buffer.
Okay.
And then we look at an active range of motion, which is how much, so if you can be lengthened to a position, therefore you've defined what we would say would be normal length tension properties for that prerequisite or that base rate. Then we want to look at, can you move yourself into that base rate as a foundational capacity that you should be able to have? And that allows us to then define an active range of motion, which is then, can you control your movement into what your demand is? And we come up with a ratio. A lot of people, sort of question our ratio, but our ratio is based on some evidence. And so we try to look for a 1-to-1 ratio of passive to active. Just means that you can be moved and you can move yourself.
Yeah,
And
the goal, you should try to control the ranges that you have, right?
Of course.
And
Yes.
the goal should be to control all of them, but we understand that the passive range will always exceed the active range.
That's right.
So, not to get into the nitty gritty of FRA, but what we're saying is that because the law of specificity states that strength attained at one angle can only be utilized plus or minus approximately 20 degrees from that spot, what we say is that we can expect to control up to 85% of a passive range of motion. That doesn't mean we don't want more, and it doesn't mean sometimes you only get 80% of it, but the goal is control as much range of motion as you have.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now we're going to, and hopefully that's clear for everybody, but now we're going to try to make it a little bit more, hopefully not more difficult, but maybe a little bit more about how we then view things a little bit differently with respect to range of motion. And so, well, I guess I should stop and say then, with respect to injury then, because you asked me, is range of motion, and is it a good outcome for injury?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is when you take these things into consideration.
It was a bad question, because what I was getting at was, generally, if you look at the research, if someone is more, okay, the old saying, that which does not bend breaks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that was the predominant thing that was that's what sports medicine was focusing on for injury prevention, right? Make people more long and better. So what I was saying is, does passive range of motion in and of itself equate to a reduction in injury rates? Or is it a smart idea for, let's say, a therapist, a massage therapist, to say, oh, your shoulder hurts, let me check the range of motion, and then when the range of motion passively gets better, you're going to feel better? Does that have relevance?
No.
That's
no.
Okay. Yes.
And then to take that a step further is if someone comes in with shoulder pain and they check their range of motion and now the pain is gone, but the range of motion didn't change, that is also not good, which is why range of motion in that, and that's what I was just going to say, when we can tease it out as we just teased it, range of motion then starts to make a little bit more sense. And then you could see two things. You can see that how inherently poor it's used in research as an outcome measure, but then how valuable it potentially is as an outcome measure when you understand it more.
Okay.
Because if I'm looking at someone as an individual system and they don't have range of motion to meet their demand from either of those two base rates, well, then, bells have to be going off and saying, well, there's a problem that's here. And we don't know that problem is going to be injury per se. But we know that system behavior is not meeting system demand, and that is a problem. But to take that a step further, to try to tease this out a little bit more, and I know we've had a few discussions on this, one of the concepts that I think is a valuable concept that we've introduced we introduced it in FR first, but we talked about it at the summit, and I want to say that it went over a lot of people's heads just because I don't know that we made it important enough
Hmm.
was that movement doesn't happen in ranges of motion per se, right? Right, movement happens in what we've termed movement zones. And so this gets us into a discussion about what those movement zones are and what they're made up of, and how that becomes important as a outcome for potential injury reduction, which you're not going to find. Nobody's going to be able to go in the literature and find this, because this is something that we've rationalized, reading the stuff that we're reading that is non-manual therapy or non-strength and conditioning research. And so let's talk about that for a second. So what we've said up to this point is, we've said, let's take the shoulder, for example. We've said that the shoulder is made up of 6 ranges of motion, flexion, extension, AB, AD, IR, ER. And we've understood them from a very basic range of motion concept. And we've understood them as being 6 differentiated movements. And what we've said is that that's not really the case. That, to be quite honest, you can't really define flexion per se, other than we know that that's movement up here. But, there's a whole variety of angles of what we could consider flexion.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've considered those varieties of angles of flexion as being the flexion movement zone. And the flexion movement zone will bleed into the abduction movement zone and the horizontal abduction movement zone and the extension movement zone. So it gets really, really hard to try to define where flexion ends and where extension begins or abduction begins, so on and so forth, which I think it's okay that that's a difficult definition, because that's how movement occurs. Movement doesn't occur in these linear, what we've termed as linear ranges of motion. They occur in what we've termed as a movement zone. And so if we try to take that a bit further in the research, they've taken, again, the shoulder is the easiest thing to use as an example, but we've then said, well, ranges of motion are degrees of freedom. So therefore, because the shoulder has 6 ranges of motion, it must have 6 degrees of freedom. And so we've done a little digging on that, and that doesn't make any sense. So if we've defined that there can be these different angles of flexion and these different angles of extension and all these other movements of the shoulder, then there can't just be 1 degree of freedom in each direction either. Mm-hmm. And so if you kind of try to tease this out and you say, okay, well, what is a degree of freedom? A degree of freedom, and I won't do this justice because I don't remember the word for word definition, but I've looked this up. And so from a philosophical perspective, a degree of freedom, we have to consider the word freedom. And the freedom part comes from, or if you kind of take that, that means the ability to move freely without constraint. That's how we can sort of define freedom from a philosophical, like, if you want to get into free will, which we won't get into, but that's kind of what.
We'll tackle that. We'll put it in a package, send it back to Sam Harris, and tell him we figured it out.
Yeah. We can kind of say, well, that makes a lot of sense when you consider a degree of freedom and range of motion, the ability to move freely without constraint. If you then look at sort of a definition of what a degree of freedom might be from like a mechanical perspective, it's essentially a variable that a system can move into that allows for the ability to have freedom of motion. So, if you kind of take those definitions and you go, okay, well, that means then that range of motion can't just be one thing in each direction. If I want to have the freedom to move into flexion in a variety of different directions, which we've termed a movement zone, it's actually made up of, I don't know, thousands, millions, billions of individual degrees of freedom.
Let me give you this example. I want you to take this imaginary baseball. I'm handing it to you now. Play with me, grab it, thank you. Now, if you throw me the baseball, go ahead, Mike, throw me the baseball. So now I'm walking. Now, when I go to catch a baseball, nobody goes like this. and catches the baseball.
Exactly.
Right? You're going to be in wherever the baseball lands, you're going to be in a representation of shoulder flexion. But shoulder flexion isn't a thing, it's an opportunity to move into a zone, as we have termed it, or of potential. So flexion is I almost fell right off my chair. Could you imagine how that would have bumped up our viewership if I fell off my chair, smashed my face against the fucking thing, and then just put down, and then you're like, great.
And you were concussed?
And then you stand up and pretend that you can see over my desk because you don't understand the 2 dimensions of Zoom. Anyway, so it's an opportunity to move into a zone. It's like we say, it's a system. So there's variability is what we're getting at. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So this gets a little bit more in depth, I think. So I think that helps us understand that range of motion and flexion, which we call the flexion degree of freedom, is not actually 1 degree of freedom. It's options of movement in the flexion, and that's how we can define a degree of freedom. It's the ability to move there without constraint.
Okay.
And so I was super excited when I found this out. I remember telling you, but I was listening to Dan Dennett, who I don't profess to understand that motherfucker at all, but
it's so deep, man. It's so hard, but yeah.
I'm hoping that, growing this beard will help me understand him a little bit, but something really resonated with me. And I was on a plane actually to teach something when I was listening to this podcast with Dan Dennett. And Dan Dennett, he comes at things from a cognitive perspective. He comes at things from a free will and a philosophy of consciousness. And he was talking about degrees of freedom from a conscious perspective. And he said, think about a degree of freedom as solely an opportunity for the system to control itself. And I was like, holy shit, that makes a lot of sense.
Say that again.
That makes a lot of sense.
You might have cut out. Say that again, because I want to tease that out. So a degree of the ability.
So Dan Dennett said, think of a degree of freedom as simply the system's opportunity to control itself. It's just an opportunity for control. That's what we've been talking about forever, is just we want the system to learn about itself. We want the system to be able to control itself in any way that it should be able to learn and control about itself. So that's how we can think about a degree of freedom. And so then you come back to, biomechanics or mechanics, and you go, well, this definition of degrees of freedom that we're rationalizing range of motion on, it's just not jiving, because that means if flexion was simply 1 degree of freedom, then the system would only have that opportunity to control itself. And we know just by what we were just talking about that that's inherently wrong. It can't be that way. So if we look at the shoulder, which is the easiest, again, to demonstrate this, the shoulder is, gosh, I don't even know. Like if you define a degree of freedom as just an ability to move, there's billions of degrees of freedom in the shoulder. I mean, and I get it. Like the research in biomechanics has tried to take that really, really complex thing and break it down very, very simply. But so to say it's just 1 degree of freedom, but in our simple understanding, we've lost the understanding of why that is the way it is. And I think, when we look at range of motion, we don't look at it in traditional things of this is what range of motion is. We look at it in degrees of freedom. Like if you look at our cars, for example, cars are the expression of degrees of freedom that every joint should have. And so we can tease out those degrees of freedom that people are not exploring. And so now if we look at the definition of what that is, well, if you're not exploring that, like Workspace, Workspace is just the opportunity to express degrees of freedom, right? And so if we look at it and that workspace is small, or there's certain parts of that workspace that somebody's not moving into, well, let's take it back to the definition. That's not range of motion per se. That's, holy shit, you've lost the opportunity to learn about yourself, to control yourself in this part of your workspace that I otherwise think you should have, going back to what your system demand is, right?
Getting back to remember at the beginning of this, I was going to read you some quotes here. And
I want to keep going on that because there's a little bit more that I want to tease
No,
out.
but I just want to talk about this workspace one. So you define workspace as the maximum amount of strict articular motion that is able to be expressed.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a lot, hopefully that makes a lot more sense now to people when we put it under the guise of, well, what does that actually mean? That actually means that you're made up of movement zones, not ranges of motion. And these movement zones are made up of fundamental things that we call degrees of freedom. And those degrees of freedom are how you learn to explore space.
Okay, let me bring you back for the people who are not in our profession for this talk. And I want to try to explain. So
I keep forgetting that this is a podcast and not just
no. It's okay. Let's go. You can go deep as you want. So what we're saying then is, so for people listening, wow, we're saying a lot. But one of the things that we say a lot when we lecture is you can't move where you can't move.
Yes.
Okay. So what we're saying is that, a range of motion that you have, let's say you have this much flexion that's passive. So if I take your arm and I go like this, you have a lot of range of motion, right? But then I say, I want you to lift your own arm, and you lift your own arm and you can lift your arm to here, right? Or an easier way to understand this for people, let's say a martial artist in the audience, if I check how much abduction you have with your leg passively, I grab your leg, I check it. So I've established some kind of passive range. And then I say, okay, lift your leg, and you can only lift it to 90 degrees. So I can passively put you into 180 degrees of a split. But if I ask you to lift your leg to throw a kick, you can only throw or lift to 90. Okay, conceivably. Let's just go with that to make it easy. So there's 90 degrees of range of motion there that is available to you passively, but unavailable to you actively. And people have, we always say that active range is important. Active range is important. And well, why do you think active range is important? What passive range is important? You should be flexible. You go to yoga, you get all bendable in certain ways. That's going to prevent injury. We know that not to be true. But why is that the case? The case is because we just said that the range of motion is not going to help the outcome measure as to whether or not you like in the way that, not the way you define range of motion. Let's just think of range of motion as how much I can move you. That outcome measure is not going to tell you if the person is safe in the range, whether they can execute in the range, whether they can move in the range, whether they understand. It's just saying that when I take your body, I can contort you under external force into a certain position. Now, you look at the research, you go, oh, it doesn't jive. People who have extraordinary ranges of motion passively don't seem to come into us with less pain. If anything, they still get hurt. Yeah, they still get hurt. So, okay, so what is in the literature, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the execution of force, or i.e. strength, does directly have an ability to ward off injury. So if you were to say, what should I do to be less prone to injury? Would you agree that from a bird's eye view of the literature, saying the words "get stronger" would be justified?
100%. 100%. Because if you break down what "get stronger" means, that is just the ability to display force.
Okay. So now, if you can't move where you can't move, correct me if I'm wrong, that means the amount of experience you have moving where you can't move amounts to zero.
Yes.
Okay. So if someone has zero experience with a particular movement, they're probably less coordinated.
Yes.
Would you agree that a less coordinated person is more likely to get injured than a coordinated person is when executing the motion that they are either coordinated or uncoordinated in doing? So,
yes.
Okay. So if you can't move where you can't move, that means you can't execute force out there. So which means you can't defend yourself against injury, because we just said that to defend against forces, you have to be able to execute forces, but you can't move where you can't move. So you can't execute force where you can't move. And if you can't move where you can't move, you have no experience moving where you can't move, which means your nervous system doesn't know how to deal with variables because it has no practice in that range of motion.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're in the audience and you're wondering why we say active range of motion is so important, don't go to the research and go active versus passive ratio. I want to see another author who used that term. No, think about it logically. If you can't move somewhere, but you can passively move there, that means when you're moved there, if something goes wrong, you have no recourse. You have no way out. It's like a foam rolling thing. If you squat and you can only squat to 90 or less, and someone goes, just beat the shit out of your hamstrings on a foam roller for 20 minutes. And now all of a sudden you can get down to full depth. Well, that's awesome. But if you don't have any experience down there, if something goes wrong down there, then you can't control what went wrong. And if you can't control a range of motion, that motion is likely to become injured. Says science, right? Like, it doesn't say it in a paper, but if you look at science, that's what it says, right?
Yeah. And I was going to tease that out a little bit more, but you did it well there. So all of what we just said there was, if we look at, again, there's a ton of different definition of degrees of freedom, and maybe at some point we'll lecture on this, but we kind of looked at it from a purely mechanical perspective, like a mechanical systems perspective. We looked at what Dan Dennett says about it. If you look at it from I know both of us have read a bit of Stuart Kaufman stuff. So Stuart Kaufman is a complexity scientist, and he says that a degree of freedom is an opportunity to do work.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So now we put that together, and we say, if we kind of put all this together and say a degree of freedom is just a variable that we should have, a degree of freedom is an opportunity to control that variable, and a degree of freedom is an opportunity to do work in a particular area that you didn't otherwise do work, that starts to rationalize what you just said. So what is the opportunity? It's the ability to use energy, dissipate energy, and express force, because really force is just energy, right? It's just an energy conversion from potential to kinetic, or vice versa, whatever the case is. So the ability to do work just means that you're having the ability to display force. And if you can't do work in a particular degree of freedom, therefore in a particular range of motion, then you're not going to be able to display that force effectively, right?
Right.
I mean, you could tease this. I know both of us have studied a lot about, the second law of thermodynamics. Not that we have to go there, but that's really what the second law of thermodynamics is, right? It's just how we use force to change ourselves positively. How do we change ourselves positively? We either lay down new tissue there, we change our ability to display strength, we change our ability to display power, we change our ability to display velocity in these ranges of motion that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do so, right? And that's where, again, circling back, that's where that range of motion concept breaks down, because I don't think that anybody has teased it out like we've teased it out, and then really said, well, the literature may or may not show you why it is an important thing for injury prevention. But when you start to tease it out, and you start to tease it out from these lenses, it makes a whole lot of logical sense why it would be an important variable, both for injury prevention and the ability to, improve your overall physical being.
Okay. Let's take it a different area, because when we're talking about flexion as being an opportunity, we're talking about zones of freedom. The system, when we look at a shoulder, we don't, we make the shoulder function like a shoulder. We give it degrees of freedom. We give it capsular space so that it increases the workspace, so that the shoulder can control a lot of degrees of freedom, with the idea that then when you go to learn tasks like throwing a baseball, if you have the degrees of freedom, if you have the knowledge of your degrees of freedom, if the tissue has been laid down, if the afference is coming from that tissue that's been laid down, the communication between the tissue and the brain is higher, ergo the learning curve goes down.
Yes.
You would say.
Mhm.
As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, getting back to one of these quotes, it's funny I said that, because one of the ones that you had said is, where is it? Here it is. The process of skill acquisition begins with the ability to express full physical capacity at each joint involved in the skill to be acquired.
Yeah.
The process of skill acquisition begins with the ability to express full physical capacity at each joint involved in the skill to be acquired. Do you have something more to say on that?
You know, I hope that is pretty self-explanatory, just kind of from what we were just talking about. But you know, most people don't. And again, this just gets us back into, you know, prerequisites and base rates and so on and so forth. Most people try to apply skill in ill-conceived ways, and I think the first, you know, really what that quote is talking about is that if we let's even go back. So what is skill acquisition? Skill acquisition, in that quote, I don't necessarily mean like, you know, you're teaching someone to do a new thing, or that someone is learning how to, you know, do jujitsu, or how to, you know, do a spinning back kick or something like that. I think what I really meant by that is that, you know, even in a, you know, a traditional training perspective, or, you know, a traditional treatment perspective, what we should be thinking about is the process of skill acquisition. Because, you know, if people are coming to you because you're a therapist in the clinic, you know, they're coming to you not because, you know, they are coming to you because they have an injury. You know, they may have some discomfort, they may have, you know, some structural something, but what they're really coming to you for is, I can't do what I used to be able to do at one point in time. So the process of treatment and then rehab is skill acquisition. It is giving somebody back something that they've inherently lost as a result of, you know, I blew my hamstring, or, you know, my ankle feels tight or stiff or whatever. When you consider training, training is skill acquisition as well. So, you know, you could take it from, you know, one particular exercise, like I want to get better at this exercise, as being a skill. Or you could say, okay, we're training in a more specific way to make you better at your chosen skill outside of the gym, whatever that sport that might be, or whatever. So skill acquisition there is sort of a generic thing to say that really what we do with people is there has to be some learning process involved. There, you know, and if people don't learn, then I don't think that you've done anything. And so really, what is learning? Learning is, you have to change a behavior of something, right?
Mhm.
So that's why, getting back to what we were saying, and I'm going to try to circle back to this whole conversation because it might be a lot for a lot of people. This is where we're talking, like, I don't think that we use the right outcome measures a lot of time when we deal with people. We're using the wrong things. What we should really be using is not necessarily pain and the VAS, but, you know, is your behavior different when I, you know, as I go through my plan of management, or as I go through my training cycle, are you actually learning things that I want you to learn? And that learning process is what, you know, inherently can be skill acquisition. And so how do people learn? Well, people learn by the ability for us to teach them about themselves, right? Because as you said, and as we've mentioned before, you know, your brain is sheltered in a very deep, dark cave, right? And it doesn't know anything about the periphery other than by the feedback it gets from the periphery. Well, the feedback is how the brain learns about itself, which brings up an interesting point. You know, these people that are like, oh, well, I only do brain training. You know, I'm really into like neuroplasticity, and I want to change the brain. Well, you can't do that. You can't do that unless you teach the periphery.
I'm into that.
You can't do that unless
I'm into it.
unless you learn about the periphery. So when I say building physical capacity as being the first component of skill acquisition, you know, that gets us back to that discussion of degrees of freedom, and it gets us back to that discussion about range of motion. Because when we teach people, or when we want people to change their behavior, we have to push them into degrees of freedom that they don't know about. And that's how you learn about yourself, right? If you push people into degrees of freedom that they don't know about, that's what gives them the experience. That's what creates those, you know, what we call those loops of afference back to the CNS. That's how the brain goes, oh shit, now I know what you're asking me to do. And so when that quote came out, you know, that's essentially what I was talking about. I was actually talking about it from a therapeutic perspective, because I remember exactly when I tweeted that out. I was talking about it from a therapeutic perspective, and I tweeted it out because I had a patient who had spent months and months in with another clinician with no change. And the reason is because there was no concerted effort to actually change the behavior. And that's what skill acquisition is. And, you know, if you take that even a step further, I know we spent a lot of time with baseball teams. You know, we can use that example that we saw in January with the actual skill coach. You know, if you look at a skill coach's requirement is just give me the human that has all of the stuff necessary for me to layer on the learning process.
Yeah, I remember that conversation because there was a bunch of strength and conditioning people in the area, and there was a skill coach, and there was us, and the skill coach was just like, yes, what they're saying, give me someone who is moldable. That's what I need you to do. And it's weird because the strength and conditioning coach, again, you're ill-defined. What are you trying to do here? Like, I don't work on a skill. You're a skill coach, but you need to tell me I need him to be able, or her to be able to do this. This is what I need you to give me, so that as a skill coach, I can make it happen, or I can train it to happen. Right?
Yeah. So.
Oh, you pause 1 second.
When I said in that quote, building physical capacity, what I was actually talking about was range of motion.
Yeah.
You know, but range of motion, how we just defined it over the last 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that the reason, as I said, that the patient that prompted that tweet was, you know, somebody who spent months and months in therapy and still had no idea about how to move themselves. Well, how are you going to teach that person, or how is that person going to learn eventually how to use that shoulder again? You have to push degrees of freedom as opportunities to learn. Just like Dan Dennis said, it's an opportunity for that person to control themselves, and that takes work. You know, that's not something that, you know, happens overnight, but if you spend the time doing that, that's how you build skill, because skill is just learning.
I think another good way for people who we might have gone deep is another way that we explained it. I think we did that at the event where we were speaking to those MLB teams, is we said, look, if I give you two, you know, collegiate pitchers, right? You have two pitchers, both, you know, right-handed, same height, same weight. They've been playing for the same amount of time. They conceivably, you know what I mean? They're two equal athletes, right? And you're a baseball coach, okay? And I'm going to task you, I'm going to say, you get to choose one of these athletes, and both of them have, what's a good fastball? You're a baseball guy. What's a good fastball?
Well, let's just say that they're like 17 and they're throwing 90 plus.
Okay. So
17, 18.
Yeah. Okay. So they're both, she's throwing 90, he's throwing 90. Or she's throwing 90, she's throwing 90. They're both the same, right? Because they have to be same gender, same everything. Okay, so everything's the same. And your job is to take them from 90, and you got to get them to 92. Okay? But you get to choose which one you work with. And I say, to the first one, I say, show me what your shoulder can do, right? Just kind of like make a circle. And the first one kind of goes like this, right? And they go like that. So they're doing that circle. And then you go, okay, well, tell me about your history. And they go, well, I had a labral tear that I got replaced. repaired. I had a rotator cuff injury. There was a Tommy John a long time, blah, 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 blah. And I have a little bit pain up here, blah, 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 blah. I had mid-back stiffness. Okay. Then there's the other one. Remember, everything else is the same. They pitch the same speed. They pitch the same. The other one, I say, show me what you can do with your shoulder. And they go like this. Okay. And then you ask that player, give me your history. And they're like, what history? I feel fine. I've never really injured. So the question boils down to, if you had to make that one of them better, if you had to increase skill, if you had to increase, who would you choose? And of course, you know this, but before you answer, there's only one answer.
Yeah, of course there is.
Who would you choose, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you would choose the second person because that's how the body learns. There's no other way to, like you said, there's no other way for it to learn other than to send feedback up from the meat of the body or visual or auditory cues, but it's pretty much what's coming back from the body in terms of afferents or feedback. And the better someone's health, if the shoulder's healthier, if it has the prerequisite ranges necessary, both active and passive, you're going to be able to increase that person's abilities faster, says science again.
Of course. Yeah, it's that decision should be a no-brainer for everybody. You know what I mean? But just piggybacking on that, that doesn't mean that first person is screwed. That just means you have more work to do.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Because the system has to listen to itself, and it's not going to listen to itself if your tissue is riddled with fibrosis and scarring and restriction and lack of health and joint space is gone, and you know what I mean? It's just not how the system works. I do want to get back to one thing we were talking about before I get out of it, because the idea of yoga, and I just want to touch on this. And before I touch on this, because we're talking about range of motion, I am in no way and have never in my career said that people shouldn't be doing yoga. I want to get that out right now.
You take a lot of heat about that, huh?
It's incredible. You know what? But having said that, we get yogis at every seminar, and I sit there explaining it, and every time they're like, yeah, exactly what I thought, right? I'm not saying anything counterintuitive to yoga. As a matter of fact, I always tell people, more people should do yoga, but I'm talking about real yoga. I'm not talking about the North American interpretation of yoga, which is I want to look like a jumping leopard, or I want to look like a squatting cheetah with these preconceived positions. I'm talking about the mindful practice of yoga and meditation. And,
yeah, definitely.
And I'm not being ignorant. It's like I've studied it from Eastern philosophy standpoint, and I understand it, and I go study it that way. Read the Bhagavad Gita. We've been talking about books that have influenced us. It's an incredible text to read, right? So I'm not downplaying it, but what I am saying though is if you're practicing yoga, that's not going to make you necessarily better at football. And here's what I mean. The law of specificity is the law of specificity in human physiology. And what the law of specificity really says is you're only prepared for what you trained for.
That's right.
And if, once again, I'm not insulting it, but if you're I always say this, if you're doing Warrior 2 or whatever the hell you're doing that pose and you say, oh, the pose is hard, but really the amount of maximum voluntary contraction necessary to hold that pose is very low, right? Like you're dealing with 15% maximum voluntary contraction, 10% depending. When you get better at it, conceivably even less, right? Less.
Yeah.
Like when people, oh, it's hard to hold a yoga pose. I'm like, well, I can do that for hours. Like so you're not using a high percentage of your neural drive in those ranges of motion. So what I say is that in addition to that, if you want to get better at a sport like football, I always say there's a lineman's running at me. If they zig one way and zag that way, and I'm only 160 pounds, right? I have to slow this guy down. If I reach back and grab his jersey, and while doing so, I do a Warrior 2 pose, right? That dude's going to rip my fucking arm off and take it with him into the end zone, because to slow him down, I have to drive 100% neurological drive to the tissues in this elongated range of motion just to have a chance of slowing him down without catastrophic failure of my tissues, right? And all we're saying is that if all of you're only practicing 10% of your max, you're only ready to execute 10% of your max, ergo it's not enough training. So what we're saying is that the perceived benefit of yoga to a lot of people is I'm going to be able to control my body in more ways, but that's not true. You're going to be able to control your body doing yoga.
Right.
And that's not bad. It's just not going to help you with alignment.
That's right. That's right.
You know what I'm saying? And then when we talk about these postures and poses, it's like, if you really understand the human body, which I hope that we've studied it enough, and we have this concept of bioflow, you realize that everything is interconnected. So the idea that you can sit in one posture and that posture somehow makes all of the joints involved healthier, that's just not true, because the one posture only stresses your hip joint in a particular way. And if you keep stressing your hip joint in the exact same way and you never explore or open up other ways to stress your hip joint, then you're going to pile endless amounts of load into the same tissue over and over and over and over and over. And tissue cannot endlessly absorb load.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Will everyone understand that, or did I go too deep there?
No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, again, let's get it back to how I would look at it.
Okay.
I think that was explained beautifully. But if yoga is more often than not some passive postures with a very small bit of active motion sprinkled in, then you are getting, the first base rate, which would be passive range of motion, but then you're not allowing for any opportunity of system control.
Now, people are going to say, but there's different kinds of yoga, and this guy's ignorant, and there's movement-based yoga, and there's flow-based yoga. I understand. I understand that there's some yoga that takes this into consideration more, and I would arguably say that makes more sense than the basic postural-based yoga that a lot of people do. But again, if you're moving slowly, it's just not enough, right? It's just not enough to control the outside world by doing a preconceived slow movements under very low minimal isometric tension and expecting that that's going to somehow translate into the need for explosive skill acquisition. It doesn't work that way, right?
It doesn't work that way. No. Well, and you could look at it as well from, let's just say yoga can be equated to a movement skill. Like, when I say a movement, I don't mean a movement. I mean like a practice of movement skills. Well, by doing yoga, then you become really good at the practice of those movement skills. But that doesn't inherently make you better at other things. Just like if you are a football lineman, that makes you really good at the practice of being a football lineman, but that's not going to translate into anything else.
Yep.
So it's just one of those things, people get so caught up, and I know you've taken a ton of heat about, well, this guy is just shitting on yoga and so on and so forth. But I mean, it's all logical. The ability to be great at one thing isn't going to inherently transfer to other things. That's just the law of transferability. Unless
what you're getting good at is the expression of yourself.
Which is exactly where I was going. And again, this is why we're such great friends, because you can finish my sentences and I can finish yours, because that's it.
Yeah.
That's it, man. That's it. And the only way and that comes back to that skill acquisition quote. The only way you learn and get better at yourself is to put yourself in, I'm using the word position here, but it's probably the wrong word. To challenge yourself to learn more about where you can move and then do work there.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of people, we have this all the time. Well, fuck, man, I took FRC and I love it, but it's too hard for me. Or, how do you guys do this? I find it just too much work. Well, then don't fucking learn about yourself. It's not easy. You know what I mean? Like anything worth working for takes work. And so, if we're saying you want to learn about yourself and you want to become better at the ability to express yourself, well, then you can't learn it from a skill. It should then transfer to a skill, but you can't learn it from a skill. The learning comes from putting yourself into ranges of motion, all the stuff that we just talked about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's how you do it. That's how you learn about yourself. And that's how you ultimately change behavior.
Well, Dr. Chivers, do you want to?
You don't have anything else for me, man? I'm on a roll now.
I have a lot, man. I have little.
I didn't know I had that many quotes.
Let's do some rapid fire stuff. And you don't have to go deep. You can go as deep as you want, but I just want to touch on some topics. I'll just say a few words, like what do you call the test with the ink blots? The Rorschach, what's it called? Rorschach. What's that test called? Do you remember the ink blot test?
I don't remember.
What's
no.
the name of the person who came up with that test? Anyway, so I'll say a few words, and you just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
All right.
Glute max inhibition.
Oh God. Banana vomit. Let's just say that.
Oh God. Okay. So you got to give me. Okay. So nobody's gonna know what you're saying unless you've studied the system. So explain what you're. So there's a lecture that you had given, and
yes,
if I recall it, hold on. Let me set it up, and then you explain. There's a picture of the brain, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a picture of a banana.
There was a I don't remember the slide. There was a picture of the brain. I think there was a picture of a glute and there was a picture of a banana. If I remember, I don't remember now.
No. Okay, I think I remember. There was a picture of a brain, a picture of a banana, and you left it up there for a few seconds, and you didn't say anything. And then you went, okay, so what do you guys think? And then you told them what everyone was thinking. You said, I'm assuming that a lot of you people in the audience were immediately trying to make associations. Oh no, it was banana and vomit. Forget everything I said. You had the word banana and you had the word vomit. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
And you just left it there and you go, what do you guys think? And everyone in the room pretty much admitted that they were immediately, when they looked at that slide, they were trying to associate them. So some people were saying, well, if you eat a lot of bananas, you might vomit. And other people were thinking, well, I don't like bananas. So if you give me a banana, I'm going to. So immediately the association was made. And then on the next slide, you put, I think, glute max inhibition, right?
Yeah, and then I put a myriad of physical complaints: low back pain, knee pain, blah 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 blah.
Okay, go ahead.
And so I'll sum this up pretty quick, but yeah, so I would say banana vomit, just because if you study any sort of neuroscience with respect to cognition or the how we process information, our brain is just an association making machine. So oftentimes if we hear things with no context, we try to make context. And I think a lot of the stuff like glute max inhibition and some of the myths that we lecture on about just being myths, that they're made from inappropriate context and inappropriate associations, just because that's what people want to hear. And it seems to make sense to our, very non-developed brains at this point in time. So as a result, that's why I put banana vomit, because banana vomit is, it's talked a lot about in the decision-making literature as being, this thing where people will actually try to make associations between two words that you give them. So that's where I think that whole glute max inhibition came from. We have no evidence to support any of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at people with back pain and glute activation, no association. If you like, there's none about any. Like, I don't even remember where that came from. Right? Like, I don't remember.
Dude, I think it was. It's been a while, but wasn't it? I think it was you and I that came up with. Didn't we do research on that? I don't even remember. We did research. Remember when we were in our residency? We did research on the serratus anterior on stupid Bosu. it's
Oh
so
no, that was, yeah, it
it's
was
so
embarrassing.
embarrassing
My
now.
research is embarrassing. Yeah, yeah. It was like,
But I
yeah.
also did some research with Greg on that hip extension pattern and glute inhibition.
Oh, so
And one of your classmates, Paul Bruno, did some
okay.
research on that too. There's no evidence for any of that.
Yeah. And the idea that the psoas is somehow tight, and that's some,
Again, so people just want to make associations. Well, if it's bad on the back, it's got to be bad on the front. And what's on the front? Well, let's just pick the psoas.
yeah, yeah. It's just, it's find something opposite, throw in the word reciprocal inhibition, Bob's your uncle, and everything's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Which is really funny. I know we're now off topic. It's amazing to me how many people in our profession profess to have, understand motor control and motor learning, and they know how things work, yet they still talk about movement and reflexes and reflex inhibition. And if you say those words, I know that you haven't read anything on motor learning or motor control.
So yeah, all right. Wow, that's a lot of topics. I suppose we can just we can leave it at
Give me
that.
the next one.
And that you want more? Let's go.
What's the next rapid fire one? We might as well take this until 11 o'clock. We got 10 minutes.
Oh, we got 10 minutes. You said here, the absence of finding is still a finding.
Yep.
Go ahead.
That tells you that that's not the problem.
All right, that one was easy. Forget that. Every single fiber of a muscle has its own stress strain curve.
Yeah. Oh man, you're opening up a big one there.
Yeah, keep it tight. Keep it tight.
Yeah, I think that was actually partly misquoted as well. I said every muscle fiber and every layer of connective tissue has its own stress strain curve. And this just gets us back to kind of trying to understand things again, to try to understand, but, in that understanding, making things a little bit more challenging. And so we've always said that muscle doesn't exist as muscle. There isn't just one muscle. There's not just ab biceps. There's not just a hamstring. It's made up of a whole bunch of different things that we call the hamstring. And as a result, each one of those things will have its own behavior. And so we have to consider that, both in assessment, we have to consider that that when we say, oh, I'm working on the hamstring, I'm training the hamstring, you're not training the hamstring per se, you're training every little piece of the hamstring that all displays its own behavior. And so you have to take that into consideration.
That's big. I was talking with Quint about that the other day on the podcast, which was, yeah, you have to, when you're training, like people think, oh, I'm doing pecs today. And when you say you're training pecs, what you're saying is I'm training tens of thousands of individual muscles, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You're not training pecs. And the idea that this particular angle of training is going to affect the pec is to not understand what the pec is made of. Similar to say that one particular direction of stretch is the direction of, that brings me to another thing. If I say the word piriformis stretch.
Doesn't exist.
Okay, so explain why. I know why it doesn't exist. I can explain it in my, what do you mean it doesn't exist if I say that? What's the best stretch for the piriformis? Why doesn't that exist?
Again, just because we can't say that a stretch targets a tissue. A stretch targets a flow of tissue. And so, the backside of the hip might be where the leverage point is in terms of where you feel that the most, but it's not the only thing that is coming under some sort of tensile load when you stretch. So we have to think about stretching as being targeted to flows of tissue, which is what the bioflow model talks about, and not to specific muscles per se.
Muscle testing.
Rubbish.
Wow. Let's talk about it. Okay, so before we get in, so we're not talking about, Ludington's test. Was it Ludington's test? Was the bicep?
Yeah.
What a fucking stupid test. I remember learning all of these orthopedic tests, and I was like, when?
Oh, dude, the amount of time, again, that I spent memorizing all of that shit so that I could display some level of clinical expertise. And how quickly I got rid of that when I got into real life is absurd.
Yeah, so Ludington's was like, if someone ruptured their bicep from the distal tendon, you get them to put their arms like this. And then if you go like this, you'll see that the fucking bicep is now a tennis ball in the front of the deltoid. I'm like, you couldn't have fucking told that when they were just standing there normally. You needed to put a name on it, you asshole. Anyway.
Yeah.
So let's talk about not like I ruptured a muscle test. Oh my God, it's weak. I'm talking about this is for your supraspinatus. Oh, you tested weak. Oh, now you test strong type stuff.
Yeah. Again, I think, well, that just goes against, anything that is a cursory understanding of neurophysiology. I must admit, I haven't read any new literature on muscle testing in years, just because it's just not on my radar anymore. But it just goes against everything. It goes against how the central nervous system actually does stuff. It doesn't do stuff in individual muscles. Our cortex isn't wired like that. Our outputs are not wired like that. And when I say wired, again, that's just an analogy. It's just not how we do anything. So to try to delineate a weakness to a particular tissue, again, I think it doesn't pass the bullshit test.
It's wrong on a lot of levels, not the least of which is the fact that the brain doesn't see itself as labeled individual muscles. These names, everyone has to understand that these muscles that we bicep, tricep, these are just groupings. This is a name of, thousands of arguably individual muscles that are wrapped in slightly thicker epimysial layers. And then we say, oh, that's this muscle. But that's just because naming, trillions of muscles in the body, if you want to give every muscle cell its own name, is a little bit much and probably hard to get across in a multiple choice test. But really, the idea that, I'm muscle testing the supraspinatus is to say that I don't really know how muscles are activated, because there is no way to isolate the supraspinatus, because really, in the grand scheme of things, there's no such thing as the supraspinatus. The supraspinatus,
yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's really just proteins that grow in connective tissue so that it can alter the tension relationship in the connective tissue.
That's right.
Which is what a muscle is. We always say this. Muscles are just, proteins laid down. They're just the actuators of movement. They're not they don't do anything in and of themselves, right?
Yep. They're engines of work. That's it.
Which is why you can't focus on them necessarily, and we can't talk about, this muscle is activated, this muscle's inhibited. It's the other thing. It's like your, piriformis is inhibited, which is facilitating your quadratus femoris, which is inhibiting your fibularis group. Like, just the words that we're using, the fact that you're saying that a muscle is inherently 100% facilitated or inhibited, is once again to not understand the principle as to how muscles contract, right? The all or none principle of muscle contraction is not denoted for an entire muscle. It's for particular motor units within a muscle, right?
Yeah, and there's people that have built continuing education on that, man. It's unfortunate, because that just shows me that you haven't opened up a physiology book, you haven't opened up a book on the nervous system, and you haven't studied motor control at all.
Which are pretty important for our topics, you think?
Yeah, quite.
All right, man, we can go on forever. I think we should end it there and just understand.
We should probably do another one of these, though.
We'll do
lots to still parse out.
I'm going to be alive for a while longer, I'm assuming, right? So
yeah, and we don't have anything else to do.
Yeah, well, we're opening up now. You said you practiced, you went back to practice recently, right?
Yeah, I was back yesterday. It was weird, man. As I talked to you yesterday. It's now you have there's this overarching thing that everybody knows is there, and it's kind of just weird now. Masks and gloves and disinfectant, and I get it. Don't get me wrong, I get it. I totally understand that it's a necessary requirement. It just puts on this layer of difficulty for people. You know what I mean? And everybody has this, like, it just feels like you're walking around on eggshells a little bit because of it.
Absolutely.
It's a bit weird. Yeah.
My brother,
All right, man.
love talking to you.
Yep.
I will put all your stuff. You should be following Dr. Chivers if you want more of these fabulous misquotes that people put up. But anyway, that was really informative, bro. We're going to talk again soon.
Yep.
Love you. Everyone
Yep, love you too,
listening,
man.
take it easy. Bye.
All right.